help myself.
What's up mga toda, it's your boy 1010. Today, we have the Xiaomi Redmi Note 7, the best entry-level mid-range of 2019, and the phone that made Xiaomi a compelling brand to look at, not only in the Philippines but to the whole world. This is considered to be Xiaomi's best-selling phone for a number of reasons, one of which is a 48 megapixel dual rear camera, a premium design for a budget price, a massive 4000 mAh battery, 6.3-inch Full HD IPS display, and a Snapdragon 660 for gaming on a tight budget. Now what we have here today is the global version with Google Play and the base configuration with 3 GB of RAM. And do all these specs make up for a budget all-rounder? Well, let's find out mga katoda.
We go Friday night, now I'm the main attraction. Basket acrobat, they wanna see some action. Tinkering with my design, twist and turn my fellow mind. Play with me.
As a smartphone in 2019, it's pretty much safe to say that the Redmi Note 7 is every bit damn gorgeous to look at, with a glass sandwich front and back panel, and actually makes the phone stand out against anything in the market. However, being a Xiaomi, it tends to look a tiny bit similar to one thing in the market, from a fellow Chinese company, the Huawei Note 3i, in whatever color you put it side by side, and it clearly shows, at least on the back panel. Because the front panel tells a completely different story with a 6.3-inch Full HD IPS display with a resolution of 2340 by 1080 with 409 pixels per inch. It is spread on a 19.5:9 aspect ratio and has a near bezel-less display. Now both the front and back glass panel is covered with Corning Gorilla Glass 5, which is more durable but still shatter prone. So getting back to that display, again this is a Full HD display with sharp and crisp detail as opposed to the standard 720p displays of phones in this segment. The IPS panel certainly does a great job of making this phone seem more premium with bright and vivid contrast, and generally speaking one of the brightest IPS panels out there. It isn't completely edge to edge however, with fairly thick top and bottom bezels, but bear in mind that we are talking about a budget phone, so it gets a pass. Of course, being an LCD panel, expect the occasional bleeding, especially around the camera module, but that's hardly an issue. The top and bottom bezels are virtually non-existent when viewing content, and you'll hardly notice that you're holding a budget phone. When it comes to viewing content, the Redmi Note 7 clearly defines that a budget phone could suffice without sacrificing a great display, with excellent viewing angles and quite deep contrast. But images and videos tend to look soft, but that's the thing with most Xiaomi, so that may be a Xiaomi quirk. Viewing 16:9 video of course can be stretched to fill in the huge display and expect to see some footage cropping, but thanks to that water drop style notch, the camera module does minimal distraction when viewing video and you'll hardly ever be annoyed by it. Now off-axis viewing is not an issue in this panel and actually results in minimal to no loss in picture detail in light refraction. That being said, the phone barely reacts to refracting objects, which results in less distracting phone usage, and you can clearly see it with whatever content you view. And while the blacks are pretty deep for an LCD panel, it still is an IPS display, so it does not compare and compete against the superior deep inky blacks on an OLED or an AMOLED display. But generally speaking, the display does not disappoint at all and well deserves to be crowned the best budget LCD display in its segment. Now getting into the back panel, things get pretty interesting and very Xiaomi. Starting with the color scheme. My example unit comes with a nebula blue color, but you can choose between space black and frost white if you prefer. But in my opinion, the nebula blue color is the one you should get, considering that the paint job is damn well stunning. It is a blue color but gradually changes to purple towards the top. And while we're out back, we can finally talk about this phone's main party trick, which is its dual rear camera module that consists of a 48 megapixel sensor with an f1.8 aperture and a 5 megapixel secondary camera with an f2.2 for depth sensing. In some parts of the world, however, they only get the camera in a 12+2 megapixel configuration. Obviously, Xiaomi did a great job on the paint job and the design with the Redmi Note 7, especially in this nebula blue color. Though of course not to point fingers, but it kinda looks like. Anyway, moving on. The left hand side has your micro SD card slot and nano SIM tray, while on the right side you have your sleeping power button and volume rocker. Now on the back we have that fingerprint scanner, which feels pretty fast but not as quick as some of its rivals, but it gets the job done pretty easily. Now getting to software performance, the Xiaomi Redmi Note 7 runs on MIUI 11 on top of Android 9 with a pretty heavy skin on Android that majorly resembles the iOS user interface, and it clearly shows. Now of course, paired with 3GB of RAM, this phone is slowed down by a pretty hefty MIUI skin, but it's pretty usable in day-to-day usage. And of course, MIUI isn't exactly the most intuitive user interface out there, so there will be some getting used to with this phone. One thing I did find very interesting is when connecting to my Xiaomi Wi-Fi repeater, it senses automatically that it's a Mi Home device, which is a pretty cool quirk in itself. And another thing is the rapid addition of fingers in the fingerprint scanner, which only takes less than 10 seconds in my case. Pretty cool. Now, getting technical, the Redmi Note 7 is powered by an Octacore Qualcomm Snapdragon 660 processor with the Adreno 512 GPU. This can be paired with either 3, 4, or 6GB of RAM with 32, 64, and 128GB storage options standard. And with my example, which has 3GB of RAM, it showed a pretty good Geekbench score with a 333 single core score and around 1155 on the multi-core score. Now I currently have no other phone to compare it to, but its closest rival, which is the Huawei Honor 10 Lite with a Kirin 710 CPU, showed pretty similar results in benchmarking, barely edging the Redmi in the multi-core by up to 12 points. Of course, it's down to real-world usage, and it's pretty much safe to say that the Redmi Note 7 excels at daily tasks with no lags and no hassles in performance. And even when paired with 3GB of RAM, this phone absolutely flies through MIUI 11, but also lags well behind some modern smartphones thanks to its Trio chipset. But where it really shows dominance is in gaming performance. This phone was meant to be the best budget gaming phone, and indeed it is. Thanks to that power efficient Snapdragon 660, there's virtually no lags when it comes to gaming. It actually has one of the best gaming experience you can have on a smartphone in this price. Then again, that's what the people who bought this phone were looking for in the first place. For hardcore games like Mobile Legends and Call of Duty Mobile, this phone did not disappoint. The frame rate is pretty high even when playing in the highest possible setting. There is an automatic optimization for games, which is on by default. And we can't talk about this phone without talking about its speakers, which is one of the best sounding and loudest mono speakers in existence, even beating most modern smartphone speakers. Though it lacks depth, it makes up for its loudness. Now let's get to the fun stuff. The Redmi Note 7 features a 48MP Sony IMX586 main camera at f1.8, joined by a 5MP camera for depth sensing. Now ideally it doesn't really take 48MP photos and instead takes them at a 12MP resolution, which is then upscaled to 4 times its original quality to resemble the detail of a high megapixel sensor. Now for the camera interface. The camera interface is pretty straightforward and intuitive. You've got your quick toggles for video, portrait, and pro modes, while the option to take 48MP images can be toggled in the hamburger menu in the far left corner. Now it also has AI scene detection, and the rear camera can recognize up to 27 different scenes, while the front can recognize 12 different categories. Image quality is what you expect from a 12MP sensor, which comes out pretty good with good dynamic range and resembles a lot of great cameras from phones twice or quadruple the price. The phone really stands out for its punchy colors, saturation is pretty good as well as the contrast, but images tend to look soft as opposed to other cameras, but still has somewhat of a crunchiness when it comes to detail. Now turning on HDR results in more bright and vivid detail, but it tends to overexpose, and in some cases, the original photos actually tends to look better than the ones with HDR. Video quality is quite a bit substandard. Of course, we have to be mindful of the price, and it's really not the best video camera out there, and videos tend to look a bit shaky, but it gets the job done pretty easily. Videos look crisp enough, with accurate colors and a pretty good dynamic range, though at times some noise is pretty apparent, although you only notice it either in low light or when changing exposure. Unfortunately, no 4K video recording is available out of the box, even though the chipset can handle it, though that can be fixed by third-party applications like Gcam or Open Camera. But regardless, this is still a very good camera. It certainly won't impress, but considering the price, there's absolutely no complaining about this module. In almost extreme low light conditions, this phone actually has the more better quality than some phones with night mode. Noise is pretty minimum and loss of detail is quite low. Contrast is also very good. Of course, the night mode is way better than the normal mode with HDR turned on, which becomes more grainy and noisy. Getting into 48 megapixel photos, the main thing about it is really the detail. Noise becomes slightly apparent and, generally speaking, does not look that great than the 12 megapixel standard sensor. Colors are slightly toned down to make room for that sharp detail when zooming into photos for a much more clearer view. Getting to the front camera, which is a 13 megapixel sensor at f2.0, it's a pretty wide camera and very much captures good photos. The detail is pretty sharp and the colors are very accurate. Portrait mode is really good as well. It does a great job of cropping out subjects, though in some cases, it tends to crop a bit much and actually makes the subject a little more thin than normal. But generally speaking, overall, both the cameras are pretty great, and especially so given the price. The Redmi Note 7 is powered by a 4000 mAh battery that supports Quick Charge 4. That battery, according to Xiaomi, can deliver up to 3 days of standby, almost a day of talk time, and more than half a day of continuous video playback. Xiaomi doesn't include a quick charge power brick in the box, and the standard 10-watt charger charges the phone from 0 to 30 in around 30 minutes, which is pretty slow but doable. With all these in mind, I think it's pretty much safe to say that the Redmi Note 7 is still one of the best budget devices out there, even so considering the release of the Note 9 with a great camera for budget price, a decent quality and specs for less than a mid-range, and a gaming-driven agenda. That's one of the best you'll ever get at this price. This phone should be on your smartphone list, and that's all. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe today, and I'll see you guys again in the next video.